I was stunned when I accidentally noticed my cheating wife at the company party. She had crawled under the table, unzipped her boss's pants, and started working on his tool. Cindy, 32 years old, a math teacher in Orange County, had always been a woman of commitment. She had a husband, Rick, whom she met during her college years, and together they built a life. Rick, kind and steady, had been the love of her life. They had 2 beautiful children, Michael and Sarah, and everything seemed perfect, or so Cindy thought. It wasn't until she made the decision to leave her job and start a new career that everything began to change. She started her own event management company, and soon, her life was filled with weddings, receptions, and endless planning. It was during this time that she met Bennett Davis. He was the owner of a chain of luxury hotels, his smile disarming and his charm undeniable. Unlike Rick, Bennett wasn't predictable. He wasn't steady. He was the kind of man who made Cindy's heart race in ways she hadn't felt in years. Their first meeting was at a convention in Los Angeles, and the connection was immediate. Bennett's presence lingered long after their conversation ended, and Cindy couldn't deny the spark she felt. He was nothing like Rick. He was unpredictable, dangerous in a way that felt intoxicating. But Cindy told herself it was nothing, that it was just a fleeting moment. She was married after all. But as weeks passed, Bennett's subtle touches during business meetings turned into more. His compliments lingered, and his eyes, always so knowing, made Cindy question everything. She was in love with Rick. She loved her family. But Bennett was different. He saw through the mask she wore. He saw her for who she was, and it thrilled her. One day, after a particularly trying wedding event, Cindy found herself alone with Bennett on the hotel patio. Lori, his manager, had already left, and the tension between them became palpable. Bennett leaned in, his breath warm against her ear, as he whispered words Cindy would never forget. "I know you're married, Cindy," he said, his fingers brushing against hers. "But if you ever change your mind, I'll be here." The temptation was overwhelming. Cindy's resolve, built over years of marriage, started to crumble. She thought about Rick, about their kids, about everything they had built. But in that moment, Bennett's lips brushed hers, and everything she had worked so hard to protect felt like it was slipping away. She pulled away, quickly, her heart racing. "I can't," she whispered, but the words felt hollow. Bennett didn't push. He simply smiled that knowing smile and said, "I'll be here when you're ready." The next few months were filled with moments like this. Every time Cindy went to one of Bennett's hotels, he was there. Always charming, always attentive, always making her feel special. She tried to ignore it. She tried to focus on her family, on the business she was building. But every time Bennett smiled, every time his eyes found hers, the cracks in her marriage grew wider. Then came the stormy night when everything changed. Cindy had just spent hours working to salvage a wedding when the rain hit. The event was a disaster, but she and Bennett worked together to make the best of it. Late that night, after everyone had gone home, Cindy found herself alone with him once again. This time, there was no denying it. Bennett's kiss was no longer just a spark. It was the fire Cindy had been holding back for months. They spent the night together, and for the first time in years, Cindy felt alive in a way she hadn't in a long time. But as she lay in his arms, guilt gnawed at her. This wasn't who she was. This wasn't who she wanted to be. Yet, in that moment, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. The next morning, as she drove back to her family, she knew things would never be the same. She couldn't undo what had been done. She couldn't erase the way Bennett made her feel, nor could she ignore the fact that she had betrayed Rick in the most intimate way possible. Rick was at home, making breakfast for their children, when Cindy arrived. His smile was warm, his love for her so evident in the way he spoke. "How was the wedding?" he asked, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. Cindy forced a smile, but inside, she was torn. She felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her, suffocating her. She had been unfaithful, and there was no way to take it back. But Rick didn't know. He had no idea that his world was about to come crashing down. The next few days were filled with a strange tension. Cindy was more distant, more distracted, but Rick didn't seem to notice. He was focused on his job, his family, and his love for her. He had no idea that Cindy was already planning her next steps, and those steps didn't include him. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Rick mentioned something that Cindy had been avoiding. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking we should take a weekend getaway soon. Just the two of us. It's been too long since we had time alone." The idea sounded wonderful. Cindy smiled, trying to mask the guilt bubbling inside her. She nodded, but in her mind, she was already with Bennett. She couldn't stop thinking about him, couldn't shake the way he made her feel. Rick kissed her on the cheek as he went to bed that night, unaware that Cindy was already 1,000 miles away, lost in a world of her own making. And so, Cindy found herself standing at a crossroads. She had made her choice, and now there was no turning back. What she didn't know was that Rick would soon discover the truth, and when he did, everything she had built would come crashing down. Cindy woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, a beautiful morning in Orange County. But for her, the brightness of the day felt like a cruel joke. She forced herself out of bed and began the usual morning routine, preparing breakfast for the kids, sending them off to school, and getting ready for another day at work. But every smile she forced, every word she spoke to Rick, felt like a mask. The guilt was consuming her. The affair with Bennett had been ongoing for months, but Cindy couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. Bennett's presence in her life was no longer just a guilty pleasure. It was a need. The need to feel alive, to feel desired, to feel something other than the role of wife and mother that had defined her for so long. But every time she looked at Rick, she saw his trusting eyes, his unwavering love, and the weight of that look tore at her insides. He deserved so much better than this. Rick had been more attentive lately, a little more affectionate. The weekend getaway he'd promised was coming closer, and he was already planning the details. But Cindy wasn't sure she could go on pretending anymore. She felt like she was living a lie, playing a role she no longer fit into. She was lost between the life she had built with Rick and the one she was secretly creating with Bennett. When Rick mentioned their upcoming weekend away, Cindy smiled weakly. She didn't want to hurt him, but the truth was, she wasn't sure she could look him in the eyes and pretend that everything was fine, that she wasn't hiding a part of herself, a part of her soul that had been taken over by someone else. The weeks passed, and Cindy found herself in a vicious cycle of guilt and desire. Each time she met with Bennett, she told herself it would be the last time, that she would end the affair for good. But each time, he pulled her in further, with his charm, his easy smile, and the way he made her feel alive in a way Rick couldn't anymore. Then came the fateful night that would change everything. It was an event Cindy had been working on for weeks, a large wedding at one of Bennett's hotels. The weather was unpredictable, and the wedding had been hit with rain, causing chaos. Cindy and Bennett worked together to salvage what they could, and by the time the guests had left, the two of them were exhausted. Bennett led Cindy to a private area on the hotel grounds, where they sat together, the exhaustion weighing heavy on their shoulders. "Cindy," Bennett said, his voice soft yet firm, "I've wanted this for a long time. I know you've been fighting it, but I can't wait anymore." Her heart raced as he leaned closer, his hand gently brushing her cheek. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, and for a moment, all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. "I'm not asking you to leave him," Bennett continued, his voice a soothing whisper. "I'm asking you to let yourself be happy. Let me make you feel alive again." Cindy's mind screamed at her to pull away, to stop this madness, to end it before it ruined everything. But her body betrayed her. She leaned into him, her lips finding his in a kiss that felt both desperate and freeing. In that moment, she forgot everything. Her children, her husband, the life she had worked so hard to build. All that mattered was the feeling of Bennett's lips against hers, the way his hands held her as though she was the most important thing in the world. The night spiraled from there, the lines between right and wrong blurred beyond recognition. They spent the night together, their passion and guilt intertwining. Cindy tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that she had a right to feel desired, to feel wanted. But deep down, she knew she was crossing a line that would have lasting consequences. When Cindy woke the next morning, the reality of what had happened hit her like a ton of bricks. She was torn between the man who had been her life, Rick, and the man who had awakened something inside her that she hadn't realized was missing. She felt like a fraud, caught between two worlds, neither of which she truly belonged to anymore. As she drove back to her family that morning, the weight of her actions pressed heavily on her chest. She had betrayed the one person who had always been there for her, who had trusted her without question. And yet, she couldn't help but wonder if this was what she had been missing all along. Rick greeted her warmly when she returned, his arms open for an embrace. But all Cindy could do was force a smile and pretend everything was normal. The kids ran to her, their laughter a stark contrast to the turmoil she felt inside. They had no idea that everything was changing, that the foundation of their family was crumbling beneath their feet. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Rick mentioned their upcoming trip. "I'm really looking forward to it, babe," he said, his eyes filled with hope. "I've got everything planned. It's just us, no work, no distractions. We'll have some time to reconnect." Cindy nodded, her heart sinking. She couldn't pretend anymore. She couldn't look at him and lie about where her heart truly was. She had been unfaithful, and there was no easy way to come back from that. As the night went on, Cindy felt like a stranger in her own home. Rick, oblivious to her inner turmoil, continued to talk about their plans for the future. But all Cindy could think about was Bennett, and the life she had started to build in secret. She tried to focus on her children, on Rick, but the truth was, she was already slipping away. The next day, Cindy found herself standing at a crossroads. She had made a choice, but that choice came with consequences. She couldn't undo what had been done, and soon, Rick would find out the truth. The question was, how would he react? Would he be able to forgive her, or would this be the end of their family? As the days went on, Cindy couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on her. She couldn't keep living this lie, and she knew that soon, Rick would find out everything. But for now, she was trapped, living in the shadow of her own mistakes, unable to escape the inevitable fallout. Cindy had spent the past few weeks walking through her life as though it were a dream, a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Every time she looked at Rick, she felt the weight of her betrayal pressing on her chest. She couldn't hide from it anymore. The guilt was suffocating. And yet, a part of her still craved the excitement that Bennett brought into her life. She told herself it was just an affair, just a momentary lapse. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. It was a reflection of everything she had been too afraid to confront about herself and her marriage. The weekend getaway that Rick had been planning was fast approaching. It was supposed to be their time, just the two of them, rekindling the spark they had once shared. But Cindy couldn't bring herself to feel excited. Every thought of the trip was clouded by the truth she had been hiding. She had been unfaithful, and she couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. Rick, ever the optimist, didn't sense the tension that hung between them. He was eager to spend time with her, to reconnect, to remind her how much she meant to him. Cindy felt the sharp contrast between his love and her deceit. She couldn't look him in the eye without feeling like a fraud. But the hardest part was the way he still loved her. He trusted her with everything, and in return, she had shattered that trust without a second thought. When the day of the trip arrived, Cindy put on her best face and tried to push her guilt aside. She couldn't bring herself to ruin this for Rick. So, with a forced smile, she packed her bags, kissed the kids goodbye, and left for the Ritz-Carlton in Dana Point. The first night was surprisingly pleasant. They had a lovely dinner and walked on the beach, just like they had when they were younger. The evening felt normal, and for a moment, Cindy almost forgot about the affair. But the moment she slipped into bed beside Rick, the reality of it all came crashing down. She had been with Bennett. She had shared intimate moments with him, and now here she was, pretending to be the woman Rick had always loved. Rick, ever the romantic, leaned in to kiss her. "I'm glad we're finally doing this," he whispered, his voice full of warmth. "We deserve this, don't we?" Cindy didn't answer immediately. Instead, she kissed him back, feeling the warmth of his affection. But inside, she was crumbling. She had made her choice, and now there was no going back. She could either continue to live this lie, or she could come clean and face the consequences of her actions. As they lay in bed, Cindy's mind raced. She thought about the life she had built with Rick, the family they had created, the trust they had shared. And then she thought about Bennett, how he made her feel alive in a way Rick hadn't in years. But as she turned to look at Rick, his face illuminated by the soft light of the room, she felt a deep sense of guilt wash over her. She had betrayed him in the worst way possible. The next morning, Cindy tried to push her guilt aside and enjoy the day. They spent the morning at the spa, and then had a quiet lunch by the beach. Rick seemed so happy, so content with their life together. He talked about their future, about the things he wanted to do for their family. Cindy listened, nodding along, but inside, she felt like a stranger. This life, this family was a lie. She had destroyed everything, and now it was too late to fix it. Later that night, as they enjoyed a quiet dinner on their balcony, Cindy's phone buzzed with a message from Bennett. Her heart skipped a beat. She tried to ignore it, but the temptation was too great. She excused herself from the table and went into the bathroom to check the message. Bennett's words were simple. "I miss you. I can't stop thinking about you. You know where I'll be." Cindy's stomach churned as she read the message. She felt a mix of excitement and dread. Bennett had been her escape, her secret indulgence, and now he was calling her back. It was a moment of weakness, but it was a moment she couldn't ignore. She quickly responded, asking him to wait for her. As she returned to the table, she tried to act normal, but the guilt was unbearable. She couldn't keep living like this. She was being torn apart by her actions, but she didn't know how to stop. She had chosen Bennett, and now there was no turning back. That night, after Rick had fallen asleep, Cindy quietly slipped out of bed and left the hotel room. She told herself it was just a moment of indulgence, that it didn't mean anything. But deep down, she knew it was a decision that would change everything. She took a cab to Bennett's hotel, her heart racing. She was both excited and terrified of what was about to happen. When she arrived, Bennett was waiting for her, his smile both welcoming and knowing. Without a word, he led her to his room, where they shared a passionate kiss. For a brief moment, Cindy let herself forget everything. The guilt, the lies, the family she was betraying, and let herself be consumed by the moment. But when she woke up the next morning, reality hit hard. She had made a choice, and that choice had destroyed everything she had worked for. Rick would never forgive her. Her children would never understand. She had lost everything. As she made her way back to the hotel, she knew that the truth was about to come to light. Rick would find out. He always did. And when he did, there would be no coming back from it. The damage had been done. The days following Cindy's secret rendezvous with Bennett felt like they were suffocating her. Every time she saw Rick, every moment she spent with her children, she couldn't escape the weight of the lie she was living. Her affair with Bennett had become a constant presence in her life, and she could no longer ignore the consequences. It was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. That truth arrived sooner than Cindy had anticipated. It was a Wednesday evening, and Cindy was at home, preparing dinner for the family. She tried to focus on the simple task of cutting vegetables, but her mind was elsewhere, on the affair, on Bennett, and most importantly, on the ticking clock that was counting down to the inevitable moment when Rick would find out. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the silence. It was a message from Bennett. "I can't wait to see you again. The next wedding is going to be amazing. I'm looking forward to having you by my side." Cindy stared at the message, her stomach twisting. She had told herself that this affair was nothing more than a fleeting moment, that it wouldn't affect her family, that it wouldn't ruin her marriage. But she couldn't ignore it anymore. The guilt was suffocating her. And yet, a part of her still craved Bennett's presence in her life. He had awakened something inside her, something she hadn't realized she was missing. Just as she was about to respond, Rick walked into the kitchen, his arms laden with grocery bags. He smiled at her, completely oblivious to the storm that was brewing inside her. "Hey, babe," Rick said, setting the bags on the counter. "How's it going? You look lost in thought." Cindy quickly shoved her phone into her pocket, her heart racing. "I'm fine, just thinking about the wedding we're planning this weekend." Rick, as always, seemed unfazed. He never suspected a thing. He went on to tell Cindy about his workday, about a promotion he had recently received. She tried to focus on him, to give him the attention he deserved, but all she could think about was how much she was betraying him, how much she was lying to him, how much she was destroying everything they had built together. That night, after dinner, Rick suggested they take a walk around the neighborhood. Cindy agreed, not wanting to appear distant, but the entire time her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about what she had done, and how much time she had left before Rick found out the truth. She couldn't bear to think of the look on his face when he realized what had been happening behind his back. As they walked in silence, Rick stopped and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Cindy, I need to talk to you about something." Cindy's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when Rick finally discovered the truth. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and there was no turning back. "I found something," Rick said, his voice heavy. "A text from Bennett last night." Cindy's blood ran cold. She felt the world tilt beneath her feet as the truth hit her. She hadn't been careful enough. She had been sloppy, leaving evidence of her betrayal all over the place. Rick had found out, and now there was no escape. "Rick, Cindy began, but her words failed her. She didn't know how to explain. How could she? There was no excuse for what she had done. She had betrayed him. She had broken his trust in the worst possible way. "You've been seeing him behind my back, haven't you?" Rick's voice cracked, the pain in his words unbearable. He had always trusted her, had always believed in her, and now that trust was shattered. Cindy's knees felt weak, and she almost stumbled as she tried to speak. "Rick, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I didn't plan for it. It just happened." Rick shook his head, his face pale, his eyes filled with hurt. "How long, Cindy? How long has this been going on?" Cindy couldn't meet his gaze. She felt like a stranger in her own life. She had destroyed everything, and now she was forced to face the consequences. "It's been months," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know how to stop." Rick's expression hardened, and his eyes burned with anger and betrayal. "How could you do this to me? To our family? I've given you everything, Cindy. Everything. And you've been lying to me, sleeping with him behind my back." The tears started to fall now, the dam breaking as Cindy realized how much damage she had done. "I'm so sorry, Rick. I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know if I can." Rick didn't respond. He turned away, his hands clenched at his sides. For a moment, Cindy stood there, her heart breaking as she watched the man she had promised to love and cherish fall apart before her eyes. "I can't look at you right now," Rick finally said, his voice cold. "I can't even be in the same room as you. You've broken me, Cindy, and I don't know if I can ever forgive you." With that, Rick walked away. He didn't slam the door. He didn't shout. He just walked out, leaving Cindy standing there, alone with the weight of her actions. She felt the emptiness inside her, a void that nothing could fill. She had ruined everything: her marriage, her family, her life, and now she would have to face the consequences. The next few days were a blur. Rick stayed at a hotel, refusing to come home. Cindy tried to talk to him, to explain herself, but he wouldn't listen. He couldn't. The trust was gone, and there was nothing she could do to get it back. Cindy spent her days in a haze of regret and sorrow. She had lost Rick. She had lost her family. And now, she was left with nothing but the remnants of her own mistakes. The affair with Bennett had cost her everything. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. She had felt alive with him. She had felt desired in a way she hadn't in years. But that feeling had come at a terrible price, and now she was paying it. As Cindy sat alone in her home, staring at the empty space where Rick had once stood, she realized something. Her life, as she knew it, was over. She had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. But as the days passed and the silence stretched between her and Rick, one question kept haunting her. Was this truly the end? Cindy spent the next several days in a haze, consumed by her guilt and the pain of losing Rick. She couldn't escape the reality of her actions. Every corner of their house seemed to echo with memories of their happier days, and each moment with her children felt like a reminder of the family she had almost destroyed. But despite everything, Cindy couldn't bring herself to let go of Bennett completely. She still found herself thinking about him, about the fire he had sparked inside her, and about the life they had shared in secret. But the consequences of her affair had become too heavy to bear. Rick wasn't coming back. His trust was shattered, and no amount of apologies or explanations could fix what had been broken. Every time Cindy tried to reach out to him, he withdrew further, his hurt too deep, his anger too raw. The silence between them was suffocating. Their home felt empty, even though their children still filled it with laughter. One night, after another painful day of pretending everything was normal, Cindy found herself in a quiet moment of reflection. She had always been the strong one, the one who held everything together. But now she was falling apart. Rick was gone, and no matter how much she tried to piece together the fragments of their marriage, they would never fit again. It was then that she received a message that would change everything. The message was from Lori, Bennett's manager. Lori had been the one to warn Cindy about getting involved with Bennett. She had been a friend, someone Cindy had leaned on during the early days of her business. But now her message felt like a lifeline. "Cindy, I need to speak with you. It's about Bennett." The words sent a chill through Cindy's spine. What could Lori possibly want? She hadn't heard from her since the night of the storm, when everything had started to unravel. Cindy hadn't spoken to Bennett in weeks. He had kept his distance, perhaps understanding that it was over. Against her better judgment, Cindy agreed to meet Lori at a small cafe in Santa Barbara. When she arrived, Lori was already sitting at a table near the window, her face tense with worry. "What's going on?" Cindy asked, her voice shaky. Lori looked up at her, her eyes full of concern. "It's Bennett. He's gone. He's been arrested." Cindy's heart dropped. "What do you mean? What happened?" Lori's gaze softened, and she took a deep breath. Bennett was involved in something illegal, something he had been hiding for a long time. It was all tied to his hotels, his investments. "I don't know all the details, but I know it's serious." The words hit Cindy like a punch. Bennett, the man she had risked everything for, was tangled in something darker than she had ever imagined. She felt a mix of relief and horror. The man she had once been so enamored with had been hiding secrets, just like she had. Lori continued, her voice low. "You need to be careful, Cindy. This could blow up, and you don't want to be caught in the middle of it. Whatever you think you knew about Bennett, it's not the truth." Cindy sat there, frozen. Her world had already shattered once. But this was something she wasn't prepared for. Her affair with Bennett had been built on lies, on the excitement of the forbidden. But now, the man she had risked everything for was tangled in criminal activity. Everything was spinning out of control. She knew in that moment that it was time to let go. She had to let Bennett go, just as she had let Rick go. Her family, her children, they were the only things left that mattered. She couldn't keep living in the shadows of her own mistakes. As Cindy walked out of the cafe, the weight of it all pressed down on her. She thought about the future, about what would happen next. Would Rick ever come back? Would they be able to rebuild their family? Could she ever forgive herself? The answer came in a quiet moment, as she looked out at the ocean. She had lost so much, but there was still time to rebuild. There was still time to be the woman her children needed her to be, the woman she had once been before all of this chaos started. Cindy made the hardest decision of her life that day. She walked away from Bennett, from the lies, from the affair. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She had to be honest with herself, for the sake of her family. And when Rick finally came back, when he finally returned to her, after months of silence, Cindy was ready to face the consequences of her actions, to face the man she had hurt so deeply. It wasn't the fairy tale ending she had hoped for, but it was real, and it was hers. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew she had to rebuild, one day at a time.